right. Welcome back. We're starting our new panel. I'm Korva Coleman, and I'd like to welcome Malika, Saada, Saar. And we're going to talk about tech support, Google's foray into protecting civil and human rights. Malika is Google's Senior Counsel on Civil and Human Rights. Before joining Google, Malika was founder and executive director of the Human Rights Project for Girls, Rights for Girls, a human rights organization focused on gender-based violence against young women and girls in the U.S. As a human rights lawyer and advocate, Malika led the effort to shut down Craigslist sex ads that served as the leading site for the trafficking of children for sex, ended the federal practice of shackling pregnant mothers behind bars in U.S. prisons, and successfully advocated for millions in federal funding for treatment services for at-risk families. Newsweek and the Daily Beast have named her as one of 150 women who shake the world. The Obama White House selected her to serve on the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS. She also serves on the board of directors for the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights and the SC Justice Group. Malika, Saada, Saar, welcome to the 2017 Media Impact Forum. In a very brief explanation, can you give us an overview of how you work to change the world through your work with Google?
Sure. Well, I certainly didn't become a human rights lawyer to work for Google. I spent 15 and more years doing the work of racial justice, human rights, women's rights, and became very intrigued when Google approached me with the idea of taking on this position. And part of what intrigued me was that I had heard a year before Google approached me, Paul Pullman from Unilever talk about how there's an opportunity for corporations to advance human rights as much as NGOs and governments, and in some situations even more than. And I was fascinated by that. And I became very fascinated with how, as a human rights lawyer, my training was you always document, right? You always document so that the world can bear witness. And there are ways, powerful ways in which these technologies that are emerging allow us to bear witness to human rights abuses. So let's think about our phones, right? Our phones have changed the conversation around police brutality significantly. So 5 years ago, we weren't having the same conversation in public discourse around police brutality. Instead, it was really a conversation in Black and brown communities. But because of our phones, right, and the video that we can capture of police brutality and then share on global platforms like YouTube, we have changed a conversation that was once isolated to Black and brown communities to an American conversation. And so how we can use these technologies to bear witness, how we can use these technologies to be able to make our world smaller. I've really come to a place of thinking as a human rights lawyer that the more digitally connected we are, the less opportunity there is for mass atrocities, right? So think about Syria versus South Sudan, right? The atrocities that are happening in Syria, we are able to bear witness to because of technology, because of digital access. We don't even have a glimpse into what is happening in South Sudan because it is not digitally connected. And then I think about the promise and power of these technologies in terms of being able to capture war crimes, right? So if and when we finally get Assad, how we can bring him to account for the war crimes because of the technologies that we have that have documented these brutalities in ways that were not possible during Rwanda or Bosnia. So for me, that is part of what is promising and powerful, is how we can use these platforms, these tools as human rights tools to better bear witness, and how we can make the argument that it is absolutely critical to understand digital access as a human rights issue.
Were you surprised when Google came to you? Did you do a double take, or was this something that you had thought about? This, I have to say, I've studied law, but I would never have imagined using a digital platform to further justice.
Yeah.
It just isn't the first thing that came to mind.
Right. Well, I did laugh when they made the offer because I couldn't really envision it at first. And then I thought about the speech I heard. I thought about how Black Lives Matter started as an online love letter to Black people. I thought about how the movement building that is playing out is not in church basements and street corners, it is online. And those pieces excited me. And thinking about how what is core to me as a human rights lawyer is this issue of bearing witness. You know, I think about this job the way I think about Mamie Till, or what has happened with the boys in Syria, right? So Mamie Till's insistence that Emmett Till's coffin be opened so that the world bears witness, so that the world knows. The 4 boys in Syria who put graffiti against Assad, right? And were taken by the police and tortured, boys, little boys, tortured and killed, and their bodies brought back to their families. And very much against Muslim custom and tradition, those families opened the casket so that the world would bear witness to what Assad did to their little boys. For me, so much of the work around human rights is about demanding that we bear witness. And how do we use these tools, these digital tools, to insist that the world bear witness?
You gave an interview to Fast Company magazine that appeared last February, and you write, "Every human rights abuse, every genocide, every act of rape, every war crime happens in an atmosphere of isolation and silence. Tech allows us this powerful opportunity to disrupt that silence, to disrupt that isolation so that we understand what is happening." Speak to me about disruption. Speak to me about disruption and understanding.
Yeah, I mean, it's that question of if we had smartphones, would we have had an Auschwitz, right? So that idea of we are in a context now where there's a narrative around building walls, right? And certainly so much of 20th century history was about boundaries and walls being created and entrenched. And I think what is very powerful right now is that I believe that the 21st century is about challenging those boundaries and walls, and that tech is a leading way in which that interrogation and disruption of walls and separateness is playing out. And so it makes sense to me that while that emerges, we also have a president who's talking about building a wall, and we also see this other dynamic that is also connected to tech around the bubble effect, right? So that we see tech also creating bubbles, and we see tech disrupting the walls and
when
the
you
separateness.
say bubbles, you're talking about people listening to their own echo chambers, only reading the media that they want to listen to and not listening to another side.
Exactly right.
Please continue.
So for me, that question is, how do we sink in to a vision of tech as an opportunity to surmount the walls, to be able to disrupt, so that these acts of violence, which always feed on silence and isolation, that we be able to shine the light and create a connectedness around those experiences. So let me give you an example of another way of thinking about this. So, you know, I feel like so much of human rights documentation is storytelling, and so much of policy change is rooted in lived experience, right? So there is a new technology of VR, right? And one of the things that Google did that I'm incredibly proud of is a VR experience of solitary confinement called 6x9. And it is a full audio visual immersion into solitary. You take cardboard, you put it to your eyes, have audio with the earbuds, and for 4 minutes, you are living solitary. And you are narrated through that experience by those who have been in solitary confinement. And the content was actually created in partnership with those who have been put into solitary. That is a disruption. That is a disruption that allows us to feel more connected, that allows a lived experience that is that of some to be that of more, even if only for 4 minutes. And I am taken by and inspired by these opportunities that we can create for the disruption of our separateness and of our isolation. And so how can something like VR help to create a shared experience between someone who has been in solitary confinement for 15 years and someone who for 4 minutes in first person can have a glimpse into that suffering?
Talk to me about the bubble. Talk to me about separateness. It's really hard to get people to listen to each other. You know, as the old song says, how can anybody be right if everybody's wrong? It's really tough to get somebody else to want to pick up the virtual reality. Because I can think of the first objection that might arise, which would be, well, if they were in solitary, they probably deserved it.
That's right. And that will always be, right? And I think the power of being able to partner with those who have the lived experience, because they are the most compelling in being able to interrogate and disrupt the indifference. And it won't always work, but I have seen these powerful moments of transformation because of their presence, their leadership, and this technology that they have access to. And I think that's the other piece, is that, you know, at Google we talk about these products for everyone, but part of what I see my role as is making sure that folks who have been in solitary, that women who have known what sexual violence is, that girls who have been trafficked also have access to this technology to be able to advance their rights. Because that is part of what it means to be able to take these spaces and disrupt them so that there is access, because digital access is about a woman's right, is about a human right. And so the work of ensuring that when we create these products, that they are in fact for everyone, and this powerful space that we can forge in not only making sure that they are for everyone, but in these challenges, in these justice-based challenges, those who are most impacted have access to these tools.
I woke up this morning and read that Google will train 6,000 African journalists how to work as data journalists using new platforms. And I was like, well, that's kind of cool. And that has to do with the fact that these are people who do not typically have access, not even to mobile, but to anything.
That's right.
Web-based.
That's right. I mean, I spoke to some women advocates in Rwanda, and they had the opportunity to share smartphones with women in a very small remote village in Rwanda. And the women used those smartphones, one for business, so if you needed the phone, then you gave about, a couple dollars for the use of that phone. So they used it in an entrepreneurial way. But they also used it because some of them were being abused. And they took the abuse, they videotaped that abuse with the phone, and then showed it to the judge and said, here, this is what my husband is doing to me. I need protection. So those ways, that we can use these tools in a manner that I think is not contemplated enough from a rights-based perspective. But I also had the absolute joy and honor of being in New York last night, where we have done, in partnership with Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative, a digital mapping of every documented lynching that happened in this country from 1870 to 1950. So that's another opportunity to be able to tell our stories, to tell an American story from a justice-based place through the power of digital telling.
What is your work like? When you get up in the morning as a Google Senior Counsel, what do you get up and go work on? What do you actually do? What projects are you into?
So my day can be spent in the mornings looking at how, now that Google is doing more work around hardware, so right, usually we were just in the software space, but now that we're in the hardware space, we have to make sure that there's no slave labor in our supply chains.
Say more.
Well, I mean, it's what happened to Apple, right? So as we have these large companies develop products and have supply chains that help to create these products, there are so many ways in which slave labor is used to create these products, different parts of the product itself. So making sure that we are not doing that in terms of recruitment, in terms of contractors. And that's been a wonderful process to work with the entirety of the company around that mission. But then my work is also around, I'm constantly thinking about the criminal justice community and racial justice issues, and how do we make sure that the criminal justice community, that those justice reformers and those with the lived experience are connected to Google, right? So the other great thing I got to do yesterday was we took a whole bunch of justice reformers, and many of them who have been directly impacted, children of the incarcerated, as well as those who had been put behind bars. And we showed them the YouTube studios in New York so that they could think about how they can be content creators. And they can use this space, which is an incredible space, right, with cameras and audio and all this stuff, how they can use that space to be able to tell the stories of the work that they're doing. So I feel like I spend a lot of my day thinking about disruption on many different levels in terms of who has access to the company, and also how do we take these tools and make sure that they can also be used in a rights-based context. And then I also have the privilege of being able to have spent many, many years trying to fight issues of child trafficking and thinking about how to use the platform that is Google to advance anti-trafficking work. So one example of that is, and this is just a resource issue, right? This is the privilege of being connected to a company with resources that cares about its presence as a good actor. And so supporting anti-trafficking organizations to do a report that gives guidance to law enforcement and prosecutors on how to go after buyers of child sex. Because another human rights violation in this country is that individuals who buy our children for sex are rarely arrested. And when they are arrested, it's for solicitation, misdemeanor solicitation. So we have created this terrible distinction between raping a child and paying to rape a child, and for the latter, there's almost full impunity. So being able to work with the NGOs and give them the support and resources to craft a guidance to prosecutors and law enforcement to really change a culture of impunity so that we see a way in which we no longer protect individuals who are committing these crimes against our children.
You talked about public square conversations.
Yeah.
This is a public square conversation. People don't know there's a difference between solicitation for raping a child and raping a child. How do you further that public square conversation in a way that everybody hears it?
So this is part of how I got to Google, was that I ran a campaign when I was at Human Rights Project for Girls called No Such Thing, that there's no such thing as a child prostitute, only victims and survivors of child rape. And we challenged the AP to actually stop using the term child prostitute, and we won. We got the guidance that they do every year.
The style book.
The style book said that term should not be used. And we used some of what we had through Google to do a video that we put on YouTube of children, right? Of young women who, as children, were bought and sold in this country and arrested for the crime of prostitution, even though they were not of legal age to consent. And these girls talked about what it was like for them to be put into handcuffs, the police car, and watched the individuals who bought them go free. And there was nothing like the power of that experience told from the perspective of a survivor and her memory of being a child in that helped us to change these norms in the public discourse. But there's so much more work to be done. And I think the power of Google is not only the resources, but to what extent we have the opportunity in partnership with influencers and NGOs to really help change the public discourse. That is a space that we can live in. So one other example of public discourse change is the issue of children of the incarcerated. You know, so often when we talk about the issue of mass incarceration, we don't think about the kids, right, whose parents have been put behind bars. And when we talk about this issue in terms of policies, and they are policies that we have to question and reform, but at the end of the day, this is also about a child's life. And we don't contemplate that child because we don't see that child, because that child has been so deeply marginalized. So last year and this year, Google did something called love letters, which are digital love letters from children of the incarcerated to their mothers for Mother's Day and their fathers for Father's Day. And that is an example of how we can use Google's platform to help challenge public discourse around mass incarceration.
The word Google actually is turned into a verb. We say frequently to each other, well, we don't say, hand me that Google, because that would be a noun, but we say to each other, oh, I can Google that.
Right.
It is so woven into our everyday language that we don't even think about it anymore. What is it that we're not thinking about in terms of harnessing the power of tech to tell us things that we don't know? Things that we might be surprised to learn, things that we might be shocked to learn.
Right. I mean, I think that's the challenge of what are the products that we create. That has to, you know, there's no neutrality in Silicon Valley, right? There's not. As there's no neutrality in media, as there's no neutrality in so many of the spaces in which public discourse is shaped and influenced. So I'm always interested in how do we create products, right, that challenge, that expand, that help us to be critical thinkers. And I think there are many ways in which tech has made us a community of engaged civic participants. And I think there are also ways in which tech has challenged how civil we are, right? Like there are ways in which there's a corrosive effect that has happened around social media that is also real. So for me, the question becomes, what are the opportunities to create products that help us to think and challenge and be connected? But I think this all goes in both directions, right? And it is all about how do we hold this new entity, this new circle of power and access and wealth? How do we hold it accountable to better serve us and to better expand the way we connect and think about each other?
This is really hard to do, but I have to share questions with other people now. It's time for you to ask questions.
Everybody would appreciate that. Hi, I'm Jeff Jarvis from City University of New York, and this is a wonderful conversation. To follow up on Korva's question just then, it strikes me that one of the great problems in our world right now is the exploitation of the strange. That the stranger is causing you problems, is taking your job, is doing things to your kids, whatever. Yet we live paradoxically in this connected world, and you strike me as a dreamer. How would you dream using Google and Facebook, for that matter, to introduce us to strangers and make them less strange, to connect the world in new and different ways?
Right. I mean, I think that defines when I get asked what do I wake up with every day, it's that question. So how do we use these technologies and these tools to be able to render obsolete a notion of other? And I think that there are many powerful examples of how we have already started to do that, right? And I think VR And 6x9 is an example of that. I think love letters that we did with the children of the incarcerated is an example of that. I think there's so many more ways in which we can do that. And in order to continue to forge that path, it's about being in very strong partnership with those who have been cast as other. And it's also how we look at ourselves at tech, right? So I was really proud of how tech has come into, I think, these voids around human rights that we see play out because of the travel ban, right? So Google and Facebook and so many others in Silicon Valley stood up and said not only that the travel ban was a violation of human rights, but we filed an amicus brief as well. We did that on the bathroom bills too. And so the other part of this is what is our identity as Google, and what is our sense of responsibility in order to really create these opportunities through products, through digital tools, to be able to render obsolete the construct of other.
Yes.
Take a few extra minutes for this conversation.
I certainly hope we will.
Thanks so much for being here. Zach Brisson from Reboot. Traditionally, Google and Facebook and other digital platforms have had a kind of uneasy relationship with the role of publisher and the traditional societal responsibilities we've placed in those entities. It seems, both from recent events and even much of what you said, that there's starting to be a shift and a greater acknowledgement that, in fact, you are publishers. How would you see Google's policy approaches and even product decisions shifting and evolving in coming years with a greater recognition of that role as a publisher for the public square?
It's an interesting question. And I'm not sure everyone that I work with in policy would agree with that statement. So let me start from there. You know, I've been saying that I was really nervous about working at Google because I've only worked in the NGO setting, right? So I had no idea of what does it mean to work outside of an NGO context. And I was afraid that it would be a very bureaucratic experience. And I've said that, you know, working at Google is actually a lot like jazz, right? Where somebody's riffing over here and there, and you have to figure out, are you joining, are you pulling back? And the beauty of that is that it's a surprisingly creative experience. And I think that bleeds into all parts of who we are, that we're in a constant conversation of who are we and what do we do better? And I think part of what you raise are questions that we are constantly grappling with and answering and re-answering. And I feel really privileged to work in that kind of context where it is not about being ideological or small-minded. It is about a constant act of questioning and questioning again.
You take the liberty of asking a question before I turn it over to somebody else. We met when you hosted a screening of Cries from Syria, a very powerful film, and thank you for showing that at Google in Washington. Could you talk about the dialogue between social media technology companies and the other media formats, you know, documentary film? How do you interact with the long form when you're sort of the masters of social media?
So what's really exciting about what's happening at YouTube right now is that, this is not going to stay the name, but there is this creation of YouTube for Good, which will be an opportunity for short form and long form documentary. And it's actually a conversation that we're having right now in terms of how does the criminal justice community take advantage of short doc and long form docs in the context of YouTube. So again, this goes back to how Google's like jazz, and there is a really interesting opportunity around how YouTube is going to be a platform now. And again, that's in a process of creation and recreation, but that is part of the hope and the trajectory around YouTube's growth.
Great. Keep us in the loop on that, and maybe we can work with you to help strengthen that.
Definitely.
It's so nice to know you're there. My whole attitude about Google has just changed. I mean it. I'm like, whoa. And so I have I just have a question about sort of greater visibility for this new direction in the human rights alley. When you said the thing about EJI and their lynching, what they've done is they basically mapped all the places where it's happened. Is that why Google went into it? I mean, I'm just curious about, I know that Google likes being able to show us where something is on the planet. And this was a mapping exercise to some extent, as well as a commemoration thing. But were you guys the key partners at the beginning? Did it involve you coming to Google and saying, we've really got to get behind this? I'm interested in how that project came about.
Sure. It preceded me, and it actually came out of Google's commitment on the .org side, which is our philanthropy side. I'm not in the philanthropy side. I was very insistent that I wanted to be in public policy, government relations. So on our philanthropy side, a commitment was made after the Charleston massacre to support racial justice. And so we have given over 20 million to racial justice organizations. And one of them was Equal Justice Initiative. And I think many of you who know Brian Stevenson know that he is just such a force and such a healer and a powerful human rights lawyer. And so he received funding. And out of that funding and that commitment to EJI and to Brian was the opportunity to support his vision of racial reconciliation, right? I mean, he, in addition to all of the work that he's done around the death penalty, has been very insistent that we have not come to terms with racial terror in America. And how do we tell that story of racial terror, and how do we make amends around it? And so it was really out of our racial justice commitment that is now not just about philanthropy, but also in terms of how we understand policy and our commitment overall to be able to support that project. And not only did we do the mapping out, because yes, we do love data and we do love to map things out, but we also did video. And this is so beautiful. It's video of the great-grandchild of an individual who was lynched. And she went back to the tree and took the soil at the tree from where her great-grandfather was lynched. So it is also the piece of storytelling that we add to it, as well as curricula, because I know that certainly when I learned about the Great Migration, it was not told to me as a story that was a refugee crisis, right? That is a story of racial terror. My daughter, who just learned the Great Migration, at a private school in DC, was not told of the Great Migration as an experience of racial terror. And so part of the commitment here is also how do we talk about it differently in terms of an educational context. So our commitment was in all those different parts.
Don't hate me, but we have to stop. She's not leaving.
Actually, I do have to.
She's not leaving. We do, because you need to do some other things. I've been a journalist for a long time, and I am deeply moved.
Thank you. It means a lot.
I want to leave you with something. I was reading some of your work over the weekend, and something sprang to mind for me, and I thought, if this is right, I'd like to read the last line of a poem by Audre Lorde, who is familiar to some of you. But the poem is called For Each of You, and the last line of it, which you will feel: speak proudly to your children, wherever you may find them. Tell them you are the offspring of slaves, and your mother was a princess in darkness. Thanks, Malika.
Thank you.
Thank you.